Exactly 72 hours before the first public reports began to surface, I was briefed on an event that was never meant to leave a secure room. I was told very clearly that what I was about to hear was provisional, incomplete, and not to be repeated. That alone should tell you something, because in my experience, uncertainty is tolerated in science, but silence is reserved for moments when the rules no longer apply. The fragment from 3I Atlas crossed what defense analysts quietly refer to as the point of no return the moment it entered the Pacific Zone. This was not open ocean in the casual sense. The Pacific Zone is one of the most densely monitored regions on Earth, layered with undersea listening arrays, orbital tracking systems, and classified detection platforms designed to notice even the smallest anomaly. Nothing large moves through that space without being cataloged, modeled, and predicted days in advance. And yet, when the fragment appeared, it did not match any projection. It did not arrive screaming through the atmosphere. It did not fracture, burn, or disperse. It slowed. That detail matters more than most people realize. Natural objects do not slow unless acted upon by forces we understand. Gravity accelerates. Friction destroys. This object did neither. Instead, it adjusted its descent in smooth, deliberate increments, as if responding to an internal decision-making process. Radar operators initially assumed a systems error, then a calibration fault. Then multiple systems operated by different agencies began reporting the same impossible data. What followed was not chaos, but restraint. No alerts were issued to civilian authorities. No warnings were released. Commercial satellite feeds were quietly delayed. Naval traffic in the region altered course without explanation. When analysts escalated the anomaly up the chain, the response they received was not denial or dismissal. It was silence. And silence, in military terms, is not ignorance. Silence is containment. I was shown telemetry graphs that made seasoned engineers stop speaking mid-sentence. The fragment's velocity changes occurred at precise intervals, not randomly, and always within tolerances that suggested intention rather than error. At one point, the object stabilized itself exactly 300 meters above the water's surface. It hovered, not briefly, not erratically, but steadily, holding position as if confirming its environment before proceeding. Witness accounts from vessels operating miles away reported low-frequency vibrations that interfered with onboard electronics. Instruments displayed patterns that were never programmed into them. Spirals, repeating ratios, structures that hinted at mathematics older than human civilization. Then, just as deliberately as it arrived, the fragment descended into the ocean, slipping beneath the surface without impact, without turbulence, without resistance. This is where the story officially ends, according to public records. A harmless object lost at sea, no threat, no significance. But internally, this was the moment everything changed, because the fragment did not evade our defenses. It passed through them unchallenged, not because it was unseen, but because it was not classified as hostile. It behaved in a way no weapon ever has. Defense officials did not go silent out of fear of public reaction. They went silent because existing response frameworks offered no guidance. This was not an intrusion. It was an arrival. And arrivals carry assumptions that no one in those rooms was prepared to articulate. If something can enter our monitored world, choose its point of descent, and pause as if observing, then the question is no longer how it got here. The question becomes why it was allowed to. And once that question is asked, every assumption about control, dominance, and preparedness begins to quietly collapse globally. Within minutes of the fragment's initial detection, defense analysts realized they were no longer dealing with debris. That distinction is critical because modern defense networks are built to classify threats with ruthless efficiency. Meteors, space junk, test vehicles, hypersonic weapons, all of them leave recognizable signatures. Speed profiles, heat envelopes, fragmentation patterns. This fragment matched none of them. What it displayed instead was intention. And intention is something our systems are not designed to confront. I was briefed on how analysts began reconstructing the fragment's behavior frame by frame, not to explain what it was, but to understand what it was doing. The first red flag came from its vector symmetry. Natural objects wobble, they drift, they respond unevenly to atmospheric forces. This fragment did not. Every adjustment it made was clean, proportional, and reversible, as if governed by an internal logic that accounted for multiple variables simultaneously. What unsettled the analysts most was timing. The fragment altered its trajectory only when passing through regions of elevated electromagnetic activity. These are invisible zones created by the interaction of Earth's magnetic field, solar wind, and artificial emissions from satellites and radar arrays. To most objects, these regions are irrelevant. To this fragment, they appeared to be informational. Each adjustment coincided precisely with moments when Earth's monitoring grid was most active. That coincidence could not be ignored. Internally, a question began circulating that no one wanted to formalize. Was the fragment responding to the environment, or was it reading it? Defense systems exist to observe. This object behaved as if observation itself was part of the exchange. It neither concealed itself nor rushed its descent. It moved as though it understood the architecture of our detection systems and had no reason to fear them. At one point, analysts overlaid the fragment's path against classified coverage maps. What emerged was deeply uncomfortable. The descent corridor threaded through overlapping sensor fields, areas where data redundancy reveals system capabilities. In other words, if you wanted to study how Earth tracks objects, this was the route you would choose. The fragment did not avoid our defenses, it sampled them. This was the moment when language inside the briefings changed. Terms like anomaly and unknown object were replaced with phrases that suggested agency, controlled deceleration, adaptive response, non-random maneuvering. No one used the word intelligence aloud, but it was present in every silence between sentences, because intelligence does not announce itself with aggression, it announces itself with confidence. I was told that one analyst quietly asked whether the fragment was performing a calibration, measuring atmospheric density, mapping electromagnetic noise, confirming planetary parameters. That question was never answered, but it was not dismissed either. And that should concern you. In environments governed by protocol, unanswered questions are often more revealing than official conclusions. What followed was an internal shift from curiosity to caution. Systems designed to track hostile intent suddenly had no reference frame. This object was not attacking, it was not fleeing, it was not hiding. It was behaving as if Earth itself was the subject of observation. And that reverses a hierarchy humanity has assumed for as long as we have looked at the stars. Defense officials did not panic because panic implies loss of control. What they experienced was something far more destabilizing: recognition. The fragment's behavior suggested familiarity with physical laws we struggle to model, and an awareness of our technological footprint that should not be possible from a passive flyby. This was not an accident of physics. It was a demonstration of capability without force. When the decision was made to stop public communication, it was not to suppress fear. It was to prevent premature interpretation. Once intention is acknowledged, every response becomes a message, and no one in those rooms was willing to send the wrong one. Because if the fragment was capable of understanding us, then our silence may have been the only honest response left. By the time the fragment disappeared beneath the Pacific, the central question had quietly shifted. It was no longer whether this object was artificial, it was whether it had come to observe Earth or to confirm something it already knew. The retrieval operation began long before anyone outside a narrow circle realized something had entered the Pacific at all. That is how these things work. By the time the public hears nothing, decisions have already been made. Assets have already moved. Lines of authority have already been crossed quietly. Officially, no operation occurred. No mission logs exist that mention a fragment from 3I Atlas. And yet, within hours of its descent, the Pacific zone changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Restricted maritime corridors expanded overnight without explanation. Commercial vessels were rerouted under the guise of routine exercises. Subsurface activity increased sharply, detectable only to those who know what to look for. Satellites adjusted their orbits by margins too small to raise suspicion, but large enough to tighten observational coverage. This was not a scramble. It was deliberate, coordinated, and restrained. That restraint tells you more than any press conference ever could. I was informed that the primary objective was not recovery in the traditional sense. It was assessment. Before any attempt was made to physically interact with the fragment, teams were instructed to observe how it behaved in proximity to human technology. Autonomous systems were deployed first, then crewed platforms held at distances calculated to minimize interference. The fragment did not react in any visible way. It remained inert, resting on the ocean floor as if it had always belonged there. But inert does not mean inactive. Instruments recorded low-level electromagnetic fluctuations emanating from the fragment at regular intervals, not noise, structure, patterns that repeated with slight variations as if testing parameters. Engineers debated whether these signals were emissions or responses. The distinction matters. One implies broadcast, the other implies listening. When contact was finally made, it was done with an almost ceremonial caution. Manipulators approached slowly. Shielding protocols were followed with redundancies that bordered on superstition. This was not fear of explosion or contamination. It was fear of consequence. The unspoken concern was not what the fragment might do to us, but what our actions might trigger elsewhere. The fragment itself resisted classification. It had mass, but not density in any conventional sense. Its surface absorbed light unevenly, bending reflections in ways that confused depth perception. No seams, no fasteners, no visible points of entry. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, internal structures briefly became apparent, shifting like shadows behind frosted glass. Observers reported the unsettling impression that the object was not merely being examined, but was examining back. At no point did alarms sound. At no point did systems fail catastrophically, and that, paradoxically, was the most disturbing aspect of all. Human technology is accustomed to stress responses, malfunctions, overloads. This interaction produced none of those. It was as if the fragment existed just outside the thresholds our instruments were designed to register, present but never fully engaged. The decision to lift the fragment from the seabed was debated longer than anyone will admit. There was concern that removal itself might constitute a signal, that leaving it in place might be interpreted as refusal. These are not questions a defense establishment is trained to answer. They belong more to diplomacy than security, and yet they were being asked in rooms built for war. Ultimately, the fragment was retrieved, but not triumphantly. There were no declarations, no celebrations, no sense of victory. The prevailing mood, I am told, was closer to unease, as if everyone involved understood that the fragment had allowed itself to be taken, that its recovery was not an endpoint, but a step in a process whose boundaries were still invisible. What troubles me most is not what was done, but what was avoided. No attempts were made to open the fragment immediately. No invasive testing, no forceful probing. That restraint suggests an awareness that this object did not arrive without context, that it was part of something larger, and that mishandling it might invite attention humanity is not prepared to receive. The retrieval operation officially never happened, but its implications are unfolding in real time, because if the fragment permitted interaction on its terms, then the question is not whether we have recovered something from the cosmos. The question is whether the cosmos has begun, very carefully, to reach back. What followed the retrieval was not confusion, and it was not debate. It was recognition. That distinction is important because confusion produces noise, leaks, contradictory statements, anonymous briefings meant to test public reaction. None of that happened. Instead, something far more unusual took place across defense institutions that rarely agree on anything. They aligned in silence. Silence is often misunderstood as avoidance, but within military and intelligence systems, it serves a different function. Silence is a signal used when a situation has no approved vocabulary. When an event cannot be framed as threat, accident, or error, it is temporarily removed from discourse until a framework can be built around it. That is exactly what occurred after the fragment from 3I Atlas was secured. Internally, analysts began reviewing historical data sets that had long been considered closed, anomalous detections that never quite fit existing models, objects that passed through the solar system on hyperbolic trajectories, lingered longer than expected, then departed without explanation. At the time, each case had been isolated, labeled inconclusive, and archived. Now those archives were reopened not as curiosities, but as precedent. What became clear was that the fragment did not represent a first encounter. It represented a confirmation. Patterns that had once been dismissed as statistical outliers began to align. Timing correlations between interstellar visitors and unexplained technological shifts on Earth resurfaced in classified discussions, not as proof, but as context. Context changes everything. This is why public-facing institutions said nothing, not because they lacked answers, but because any answer would imply a recognition they were not prepared to admit. Recognition that humanity may have crossed a threshold without realizing it. Recognition that observation is not always passive and that silence from above does not necessarily mean absence. One senior official reportedly remarked that the most unsettling aspect of the fragment was not its technology, but its restraint. It did not interfere. It did not communicate overtly. It did not demonstrate force. Those are the behaviors of something that does not need to persuade or threaten. Those are the behaviors of something that already understands the environment it is operating within. This realization reframed the fragment's arrival entirely. If this were confusion, systems would have defaulted to testing boundaries, probing, broadcasting, making noise to provoke a response. None of that occurred. Instead, protocols shifted toward observation and containment, as if the priority was not defense, but interpretation. That alone suggests that the fragment fit into a broader, unspoken model of reality that only a few were aware of. Silence also served another purpose. It prevented narrative collapse. Once the idea that humanity might be under observation enters public discourse without structure, it destabilizes more than security planning. It destabilizes identity. Our myths of exploration, dominance, and isolation no longer hold if we are not the first to arrive or the only ones watching. I was told that several agencies independently reached the same conclusion and never formally shared it. They didn't need to. The data spoke for itself. When institutions that thrive on control choose restraint instead, it is because they recognize a situation where control is no longer absolute. The fragment's presence forced a quiet reevaluation of what readiness actually means. Not readiness to fight, but readiness to be seen. To be assessed by something operating on a timescale and intelligence gradient we do not control. This is not the language of invasion. It is the language of surveillance, of long-term observation, of patience. And patience is the most unnerving quality of all, because patience implies time, and time implies inevitability. The silence that followed the fragment's retrieval was not an admission of weakness. It was an acknowledgement that humanity may have entered a monitored phase of its existence without consent, without ceremony, and without the ability to opt out. That silence continues, not because nothing is happening, but because too much is. And until a narrative is found that can contain what the fragment represents, the most responsible action, from their perspective, is to say nothing at all. The final question defense officials confronted was not what the fragment was, but what its arrival meant for humanity's timeline. This was not treated as an isolated anomaly. Internally, it was described as a marker, a dividing line between a period of assumed solitude and a new phase of awareness. Once something enters our world deliberately and remains, history no longer moves forward the same way. It bends. What unsettled planners most was timing. The fragment arrived during an era of rapid technological acceleration. Artificial intelligence advancing faster than regulation, energy systems approaching planetary scale, surveillance networks extending beyond Earth. These developments were once viewed as human milestones. After the Pacific event, they began to look like thresholds, moments a civilization reaches just before it is noticed or just before it becomes interesting to something older. This reframing changed the way past progress was interpreted. Breakthroughs once attributed to coincidence or human ingenuity were quietly re-examined in relation to previous interstellar encounters, not as proof of guidance, but as correlation. When patterns repeat across decades, coincidence becomes a weaker explanation. The idea emerged that humanity may not be inventing its future alone, but advancing within boundaries it does not see. The fragment itself became symbolic, not a weapon, not a warning in the conventional sense, more like a punctuation mark, a pause inserted into our narrative by an external author. It did not destroy, demand, or announce. It simply arrived and waited. That restraint suggested confidence. Confidence that observation alone could alter our trajectory without force. Philosophers and scientists brought into closed discussions began asking questions that would have sounded absurd months earlier. What does readiness actually mean? Is it technological capacity or social maturity? Is it cooperation, restraint, or the ability to survive our own creations? The fragment offered no answers, only pressure, a sense that evaluation had begun long before we noticed. This is why the future suddenly feels compressed. Decisions that once seemed distant now carry disproportionate weight. How we deploy intelligence, how we treat our planet, how we manage power, these are no longer internal matters. If the fragment represents observation, then our choices are data, our conflicts are signals. Our restraint or lack of it becomes part of a larger record. The most disturbing implication is not that humanity is small, but that it may be late. Late to recognize it was never alone. Late to realize that survival might require more than innovation. The fragment's arrival suggests the clock was already running. And now, whether we acknowledge it or not, the timeline has shifted. What comes next will not depend on discovery, but on behavior.